They will never know how I truly survived those difficult years, nor the man I loved in silence for 7 decades. My name is Rosa Benedetti, and I am 89 years old. My hands shake now as I hold this photograph, yellowed with age, creased from hiding it so many times. For 70 years, I have kept this secret buried deeper than the olive pits we planted in our courtyard, deeper than the fear we carried in our hearts during those challenging, beautiful days of 1943. You see, when people ask me about those times, they want to hear about courage, about survival, about how a 20-year-old girl managed to keep her family safe when the world was changing around us. They want to know about the bread I found, the officials I convinced, the nights I spent listening for the sound of footsteps on cobblestones. But they never ask about love. They never ask about the heart that beat inside this young woman's chest, the heart that chose to love the most impossible man at the most impossible time. They never ask about the letters I never sent, the words I never spoke, the choice I made that saved my family but broke something inside me that never quite healed. Until now, I have let them believe what they wanted to believe. That I was simply brave, that I was simply strong, that I was simply alone. But as I sit here in my kitchen in Montreuil-sur-Mer, looking out at the same Mediterranean waters that once reflected the fires of conflict, I can no longer carry this weight by myself. My granddaughter has moved to Milano. My neighbors think I am just another old woman feeding cats and tending to geraniums. They do not know that every sunset, I still look toward the hills and remember a pair of eyes that saw through my soul. They do not know that for 70 years, every September 15th, I have walked to the old church of San Giovanni and lit a candle, not for those who passed away as they assume, but for the living, for a love that survived when everything else was falling apart. Tonight, I will tell you the truth, all of it, because some secrets are too heavy to take to the grave, and some loves are too beautiful to remain untold. But first, you must understand the world we lived in. You must understand what it meant to be young and afraid and desperately, impossibly in love when the very act of loving could mean danger for everyone you held dear. I was born in 1923 in a village so small it barely appears on maps. Castelmazzano, perched like a bird's nest on the rocky cliffs of Basilicata. My pap, Giuseppe, was a stonemason who carved angels from marble when there was work and carved hope from air when there wasn't. My mama, Lucia, had hens that could make miracles from flour and water, hens that smelled of rosemary and worry. We were not rich, but we were not poor either. We had our small house with the blue shutters, our olive trees that gave us oil for the winter, our chickens that provided eggs when they felt generous. I had 2 younger brothers, Marco, who was 17 and dreamed of becoming a doctor, and little Antonio, who was only 14 but could make anyone laugh even when there was nothing to laugh about. Life was simple then. I would wake before dawn to help Mama with the bread, walk to the market with our wooden basket, spend afternoons mending clothes or helping Pap in his workshop. In the evenings, we would gather around our small radio and listen to music from Roma, or Pap would tell us stories of his grandfather who fought for Italian unity. I was not considered the most beautiful girl in our village. That honor belonged to Caterina Rossi, with her golden hair and green eyes, but I was known for my fierce spirit. Rosa has fire in her blood, the old women would say, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with worry. I would speak my mind when others stayed silent. I would defend the weak when others looked away. My mama would shake her head and say, Rosa, that tongue of yours will get you in trouble one day. She had no idea how prophetic those words would be. The difficult times came to us slowly, like a shadow creeping across our mountains. First, we heard stories from the larger cities. Then, young men began disappearing from our village called to serve their country. They said, though many left in the middle of the night without saying goodbye. Food became scarce. Our radio began broadcasting more warnings than music. By 1943, when I had just turned 20, the troubles were no longer something happening to other people in other places. They were in our kitchens, counting our rations of flour. They were in our bedrooms, keeping us awake with the sound of planes passing overhead. They were in our churches, where we prayed for sons and husbands and brothers whose faces we might never see again. The foreign soldiers arrived in September, like a gray tide washing over our hills. They set up checkpoints on the roads, took over houses for their officers, posted notices in broken Italian about curfews and penalties for suspicious behavior. Their boots echoed against our ancient stones, a rhythm that spoke of control, of power, of lives that could be changed with a single command. But even then, even as uncertainty settled into our bones like winter cold, I could not have imagined what was coming. I could not have imagined that in just a few weeks, I would meet the man who would change everything. The man whose love would become both my salvation and my greatest burden. The man I have never stopped loving, even though I have never spoken his name aloud. The first time I truly understood what those difficult times meant, I was standing in line for bread at Signora Moretti's bakery. It was October, and the morning air bit at our faces like tiny teeth. I had been waiting since before sunrise, clutching our ration cards and the few lira Pap had managed to earn from carving a headstone for the Benedetti family, no relation to us, just the cruelty of sharing a name with those who had passed. There were 12 women ahead of me, all of us wrapped in black shawls, all of us trying not to look at each other's hollow cheeks, all of us pretending we couldn't hear our children crying from hunger at home. We had learned to make ourselves small, invisible, unremarkable. The authorities had made it clear that any gathering of more than 3 people could be considered suspicious. Even waiting for bread had become an act of quiet rebellion. When my turn finally came, Signora Moretti looked at me with eyes that had aged 10 years in 10 months. "Only half a loaf today, Rosa," she whispered. "The flour shipment, it never arrived. Half a loaf for a family of 5. I stared at the small, dark bread in my hands, more sawdust than wheat, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. Hearts can be mended. This was something deeper, something that would leave scars I carry even now. I walked home slowly, trying to stretch those few minutes before I had to face Mama's questioning eyes, before I had to watch my brothers divide their portions so that Pap and I could eat more. We had developed our own mathematics of survival. Who needed the most energy for work, who could function longest on the least food, who was growing and who had stopped growing because there simply wasn't enough to fuel their dreams of becoming tall. But it wasn't just the hunger. Hunger, we could understand. Hunger was an enemy with a face, a problem with potential solutions. It was the fear that truly ate at us, the kind of fear that makes you jump at the sound of footsteps, that makes you practice smiling in the mirror so the authorities won't see your terror, that makes you count the hiding places in your house every night before you sleep. The fear had colors: gray, like the uniforms that patrolled our streets; black, like the smoke from houses that had been searched and found wanting; red, like the stains on the cobblestones after Signor Alberti was hurt for being caught outside after curfew; white, like the face of my mama when she realized that Pappy's comments against the regime had been overheard by the wrong ears. We learned new prayers that autumn, not the ones from our catechism, but the prayers you whisper when you hear boots approaching your door. Please let them pass. Please let them not have heard about Pappy's words. Please let them not notice that Marco looks older than his 17 years. Please let them not see the fear in our eyes, because fear makes them suspicious, and suspicion makes them dangerous. I became an expert in invisibility. I learned to walk with my shoulders curved inward, my eyes fixed on the ground, my expression carefully neutral. I learned to speak in a voice to tones lower than natural, because young women who sounded too confident attracted attention. I learned to hide my figure under loose dresses and heavy shawls, because soldiers far from home sometimes forgot the difference between desire and force. My brothers changed too. Marco, who had always been the studious one, began coming home with scraped knuckles and torn shirts. He never told us what happened, but we knew. The older boys in our village had formed their own brotherhood of resistance, nothing organized, nothing political, just teenagers who refused to bow their heads when the occupiers passed. They would write messages on walls in the middle of the night, or move road signs to send patrols in the wrong direction, or redistribute food from official supply trucks to families with small children. Little Antonio became our messenger. At 14, he was small enough to crawl through spaces adults couldn't reach, quick enough to run information between houses, clever enough to listen at doorways without being noticed. He brought us news, which roads were being watched, which families had been marked as suspicious, which of our neighbors had begun cooperating with the occupiers. And Pap began to fade, not from illness or hunger, though both were taking their toll. He faded from shame. Shame that he could not protect his family. Shame that he had to watch his wife and children grow thin while he carved monuments for those who controlled our village. Shame that his strong hands could shape marble but could not shape a world where his sons did not have to risk their lives for a crust of bread. One evening in November, as we sat around our table sharing a dinner of watery soup and hope, Pap put down his spoon and looked at each of us in turn. His eyes were wet, though he would never admit to crying. "I need to tell you children something," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. "If something happens to me, if they come for me, your mama will tell you what to do. But I want you to promise me now, all three of you, that you will take care of each other, that you will survive, that you will remember this family existed, and that we loved each other." Marco's jaw tightened. Antonio reached for Mama's hand, and I felt something ignite in my chest. Not just the fire the old women always said was in my blood, but something fiercer, something that would burn down the world before it would let harm come to the people I loved. "No, Pap," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Nothing is going to happen to you. I won't let it." He smiled then, the first real smile I had seen from him in months. "My Rosa," he said, "my little lioness. What could you possibly do against such powerful forces?" I didn't answer him that night. I couldn't. I didn't yet know what I was capable of. What lengths I would go to. What prices I would pay to keep that promise. I didn't know that within weeks, I would discover reserves of courage I never knew I possessed, and that I would also discover a love so powerful it would nearly destroy everything I was fighting to save. But I was about to learn. The first time I took food that wasn't ours, my hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the cheese. It was December, and we had been living on turnip soup for 6 days. Antonio had fainted twice, and Mama's cheeks had become so hollow that she looked like the saints in our church, beautiful and ethereal and heartbreaking. The official supply depot was housed in the old monastery of Sant'Angelo just outside our village. I had walked past it dozens of times, always keeping my eyes down, always hurrying. But that morning, I noticed something. The guard who usually watched a side entrance had been replaced by a younger soldier who spent more time smoking cigarettes and staring at the mountains than watching for desperate villagers. I waited until the afternoon shift change, when there would be exactly 10 minutes of confusion as the new guards received their instructions. I wore my oldest dress, the one that made me look like a beggar, and I wrapped my head in my mama's black mourning shawl. I became every old woman who had ever shuffled through our streets, invisible in her grief and poverty. The side door was unlocked, another small miracle in a world that had forgotten miracles. I slipped inside, my heart beating so loudly I was certain it would echo off the stone walls. The storage room smelled of cured meat and possibilities. Shelves lined the walls, filled with tinned goods, blocks of cheese, salamis hanging like prayers answered. I took only what could fit in my shawl without creating suspicious bulges. A small wheel of pecorino, 2 tins of meat, a handful of dried figs that reminded me of happier times. As I crept back toward the door, I heard footsteps, foreign voices, coming closer. There was nowhere to hide except behind a stack of flour sacks. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall and held my breath. The voices grew louder, closer. I could smell cigarette smoke and boot polish. If they found me, I would not be the first young woman to disappear into the night. Mama would never know what happened to me. My brothers would blame themselves for not protecting me. But they passed. The voices faded. I waited another eternity, probably only 5 minutes, before creeping out of my hiding place and slipping back through the side door. By the time I reached home, my entire body was shaking, but I had food in my hands. Real food. Food that would put color back in my brothers' faces and erase, for one night at least, the worry lines around my mama's eyes. That night, as we shared the acquired cheese and meat, as we tasted abundance for the first time in months, I saw something change in my family's faces. Hope. Dangerous, necessary hope. "Where did you find this, Rosa?" Mama asked, though her tone suggested she already knew she didn't want the answer. "Does it matter?" I replied. "We eat tonight. We live another day." Pap studied my face across the candlelight. "Rosa, no questions," I said firmly. "There are no innocent choices anymore, only survival." From that night forward, I became our family's lifeline to the world of the Fed. I learned the schedules of every guard, the habits of every sentry. I discovered that the baker's assistant, Giorgio, could be convinced to set aside day-old bread in exchange for small favors, mending his shirts, carrying messages to a girl in the next village who had caught his eye. I found that the foreign cook, Hans, discarded food that was still perfectly good by our desperate standards, and that he emptied his refuse at the same time every evening. I became an expert in the economics of survival. I learned which farmers might trade vegetables for labor, which shopkeepers might forget to count their inventory if a young woman smiled at them in just the right way. I discovered that information was as valuable as food, knowing which roads were clear, which houses were being watched, which soldiers were homesick enough to be kind to a girl who reminded them of their sisters. But it wasn't just about acquiring and trading. I began to see patterns, opportunities, weaknesses in the system that was trying to control us. The occupying command had established a routine. They collected intelligence reports every Tuesday, conducted house searches on Fridays, rotated guard posts every 2 weeks. They were efficient, but efficiency breeds predictability, and predictability could be exploited. I started helping other families, quietly, carefully. I would leave food on doorsteps of houses with small children. I would whisper warnings about upcoming searches to women in the market. When Signora Conti's grandson was detained for being out after curfew, I managed to slip a message to his cell through a guard who had grown fond of my smile and my carefully practiced broken German. My brothers began to notice the change in me. Marco would watch me with a mixture of admiration and worry. "You're different, Rosa," he said one evening as we walked to the well for water. "You're harder." "The world is hard," I replied. "We adapt or we perish. But what if adapting changes us into people we don't recognize?" I had no answer for him then. I didn't yet understand that he was seeing something I couldn't see in myself, that in my desperate fight to save my family's bodies, I was slowly losing pieces of my soul. That each successful acquisition, each small deception, each calculated risk was building walls around my heart that would take decades to tear down. Antonio, meanwhile, had become fascinated by my transformations. He would watch me practice expressions in our cracked mirror, perfecting the look of hungry desperation that made guards lower their defenses, or the expression of innocent confusion that convinced officials I was too simple to be a threat. "Teach me," he begged one afternoon. "Teach me to be invisible like you." "No," I said sharply. "Absolutely not. But I could help." You could get hurt." I turned to face him, and I saw myself reflected in his dark eyes, this sister who had become someone he barely recognized, someone harder and cleverer and more dangerous than the girl who used to braid his hair and tell him bedtime stories. "This is my burden, Antonio. Let me carry it." What I didn't tell him, what I couldn't tell any of them, was that I was beginning to enjoy it. The danger, the challenge, the moment when I walked out of a restricted area with food hidden in my clothes and no one had caught me. I was good at survival, and being good at something, even something morally complex, gave me a sense of power I had never felt before. I was becoming someone my younger self wouldn't have recognized, someone my family needed but might not have liked. Someone who was about to meet a man who would see through all my carefully constructed facades and fall in love with the girl I was trying so hard to protect. Someone who was about to discover that the most dangerous thing she could acquire was not food or information or hope. It was love. I first saw him on January 17, 1944. I remember the date because it was the feast day of Sant Antonio Abate, and Mama had sent me to the church with our last few coins to light a candle for protection. The morning was bitter cold, with frost covering the cobblestones like scattered diamonds, and my breath formed small clouds that disappeared as quickly as prayers. He was standing near the fountain in the piazza, studying a map with the kind of concentration that suggested his life depended on understanding every line, every symbol. At first glance, I took him for another foreign officer, tall, fair-haired, wearing the gray uniform that had taught us all to look away quickly. But something made me pause behind the corner of Signor Benedetti's house and watch him more carefully. His movements were wrong, too careful, too aware. Foreign officers walked through our village with the confidence of conquerors, expecting the world to part before them. This man moved like someone who understood that he was in enemy territory, like someone who knew that his survival depended on not being noticed. When he turned toward the church, I saw his face clearly for the first time, and something in my chest forgot how to beat properly. He was handsome, yes, but it wasn't his beauty that stopped me. It was his eyes. Even from a distance, even shadowed by the brim of his cap, I could see that they held the same exhaustion, the same carefully controlled fear, the same desperate hope that I saw in my own reflection every morning. He was not what he appeared to be. I was certain of it, though I couldn't have explained how I knew. Something in the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze moved constantly, assessing dangers and escape routes. He was someone like me, someone pretending to be what he was not in order to survive. I should have walked away. Every instinct my family had developed over the past year screamed at me to avoid any contact with uniformed soldiers, regardless of my suspicions. But instead, I found myself following him at a careful distance, curious about this man who moved through our village like a ghost wearing the clothes of our oppressors. He entered the church of San Giovanni, the same church where I would later light candles in his memory for 70 years. I waited several minutes before following him inside, slipping through the heavy wooden doors as quietly as a shadow. The church was empty except for him and old Padre Francesco, who was sweeping near the altar with movements so slow and deliberate they seemed like a meditation on the passage of time. The soldier, if that's what he truly was, stood before the statue of the Madonna, his cap in his hands, his lips moving in what looked like prayer. I pretended to examine the painted Stations of the Cross, but I was watching him, studying the profile that looked carved from the same marble Pap worked with, listening to the rhythm of words I couldn't quite hear. When he finished his prayer and turned to leave, our eyes met for the first time. The world became very still. Not quiet, I could still hear Padre Francesco's broom scratching against the stone floor, still hear the wind rattling the shutters of the church windows. But still in the way that significant moments are still, as if time itself is holding its breath to see what will happen next. His eyes were brown, not the cold brown of winter earth, but the warm brown of chestnuts roasting over a fire, of my mama's eyes when she smiled at one of Antonio's jokes, of safety and home and all the things difficult times had taught us to stop believing in. For perhaps 3 seconds, we simply looked at each other. In those 3 seconds, I learned more about him than I had discovered about most people in my entire life. I learned that he was afraid but not ashamed of his fear. I learned that he carried sorrow but had not let it break him. I learned that he saw me not the invisible girl I had trained myself to become, but the person I was beneath all my careful disguises. And I learned that I was in terrible, wonderful, impossible trouble. He nodded slightly, the kind of acknowledgement one stranger might give another in a holy place, and walked toward the door. As he passed me, he murmured something in Italian that was almost perfect but carried the faintest accent I couldn't place. Che Dio la benedica, signorina. May God bless you, miss. After he left, I stood in that church for a long time, staring at the spot where he had been praying, trying to convince myself that the encounter had meant nothing. That he was simply another soldier passing through our village, that I would never see him again, that the strange flutter in my chest was just hunger or cold or the residual fear that came from being so close to a uniform. But I knew I was lying to myself. And when I finally left the church and walked home through streets that suddenly seemed different, brighter somehow, more full of possibility, I found myself looking over my shoulder, hoping for another glimpse of brown eyes and borrowed prayers. I saw him again 3 days later. This time, he was coming out of the post office, moving with that same careful awareness that had first caught my attention. When he noticed me approaching with my market basket, he stepped aside with elaborate courtesy and touched the brim of his cap. "Buongiorno, signorina." "Buongiorno," I replied. And then, because something in his face invited boldness, I added, Lane on di qui. You're not from here. It wasn't a question. He studied me for a moment, and I saw him make the same calculation I was making: how much truth was safe, how much risk was worth taking. No, he said finally. Sono di molto lontano. I'm from very far away. And yet you pray to our Madonna. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first smile I had seen in months that wasn't tinged with desperation or fear. The Madonna hears all prayers, I think, even from strangers. Especially from strangers, I said, surprising myself with my boldness. She knows what it means to be far from home. We stood there in the winter sunlight, two people who had learned to trust no one, sharing a moment of perfect understanding. Then he glanced around, his instincts reasserting themselves, and the moment fragmented. I must go, he said, but perhaps we might speak again. If you are often at the church. I pray there sometimes, I said carefully. For my family. For? Protection. Protection is something we all need, he replied. Until we meet again, may you find what you seek. He walked away, but this time I noticed that he took the long route back to wherever he was staying, the route that would keep him visible from the church for several more minutes, as if he, too, was reluctant to let the moment end. That night, I lay awake staring at our ceiling and trying to convince myself that I was not falling in love with a man whose name I didn't know, whose story I couldn't guess, whose very presence in my life could mean danger for everyone I was fighting to protect. But hearts, I was learning, don't listen to reason. Hearts create their own mathematics, their own logic, their own dangerous certainties. By the time I fell asleep, I had already decided I would find a reason to visit the church the next day, and the day after that, and for as many days as it took to learn the name of the man who had looked at me like I was something more than just another girl trying to survive in difficult times. His name was Klaus Weber, and he had left his post. I learned this on a February morning when the world was white with snow and black with possibility. We had been meeting in secret for 3 weeks, brief encounters in the church, whispered conversations by the old olive mill, stolen moments that felt like small miracles in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. He had been born in Austria but raised in northern Italy by his Italian mother after his father passed away in the previous conflict. When his homeland's military came recruiting, Klaus had felt the pull of his father's country, the promise of purpose and brotherhood and a chance to make something meaningful of his life. But the reality of military service, the villages occupied, the families separated, the slow erosion of everything he had believed about honor and duty had eventually broken something essential inside him. I could not be part of it anymore, he told me as we stood in the ruins of the old watchtower overlooking our valley. I could not wake up one more morning knowing that I was helping to control the world instead of protecting it. So he had walked away, not dramatically, not in a moment of grand rebellion, but quietly, carefully, methodically. He had volunteered for a reconnaissance mission in the mountains, then simply never returned. His commanding officers assumed he had been lost to partisans. His fellow soldiers mourned him as a casualty of the Troubles. And Klaus Weber, officially missing, began the delicate work of learning how to live. He had been surviving by moving from village to village, working odd jobs for farmers who needed help but didn't ask too many questions, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, slowly making his way south toward Allied territory. Our village was supposed to be a brief stop, a place to rest for a few days before continuing his journey. But then he had seen me in the church, and everything had changed. I should have kept walking, he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. I should have left the next day, but I couldn't. For the first time in 2 years, I had found someone who looked at me and saw a man instead of a uniform, someone who wasn't afraid when I smiled. I understood. For months, I had been so focused on survival that I had forgotten what it felt like to be young, to be desired, to be seen as more than just a provider and protector for my family. With Klaus, I rediscovered parts of myself I had thought were gone forever. When he looked at me, I wasn't the hard, calculating woman who acquired food and manipulated soldiers. I was simply Rosa, 20 years old, alive, capable of being loved. We began meeting every few days. Always carefully, always with elaborate precautions. He would leave messages for me hidden in a crack in the wall behind the church. I would signal safe meeting times by hanging my blue shawl on our clothesline in specific patterns. We developed our own language of survival, our own code that let us love each other without endangering each other. But by March, the situation in our village had become desperate. Food was scarcer than ever. Foreign patrols had increased in response to increased resistance activity in the mountains. 3 young men from neighboring villages had been taken away for suspicious activities. The walls were closing in around all of us. And then Antonio disappeared. He had gone to the market as he did every few days, carrying our ration cards and what little money Pap had earned from his work. When he didn't return by evening, we tried to convince ourselves that he had simply found some opportunity, maybe work with one of the farmers, maybe a chance to trade for extra food that required an overnight journey. But when morning came and there was still no sign of him, we knew. Marco wanted to go immediately to the official command post to ask about him, but Pap grabbed his arm. "They will ask why we think they have him," he said. "They will want to know what he was doing that might have attracted their attention. And then they will have all of us." We waited. For 3 days, we waited, listening to every footstep on our street, watching every shadow that might be Antonio returning home. Mama stopped eating entirely. Pap aged 10 years in 3 days. Marco began making plans, wild, desperate plans that would have gotten him hurt and accomplished nothing. And I went to Klaus. I found him at our usual meeting place by the old mill, and when he saw my face, he immediately knew that everything had changed. I told him about Antonio, about our fear, about our helplessness. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from concern to something deeper, something that looked like guilt and calculation and a growing resolve. "I think I know where he is," he said finally. "There is a holding facility about 20 kilometers north of here. They take young men who are suspected of resistance sympathies for questioning. Can you find out for certain? Can you, Rosa?" He took my hands in his, and I felt how much they were shaking. "Listen to me carefully. I can help your brother. I still have my papers, my uniform. I can get into that facility, find out if he's there, possibly even arrange his release. But if I do this, I can never come back here. Too many people will see me, will remember me. My identity will be compromised. I will have to keep moving, keep running, maybe forever." I stared at him, understanding slowly dawning. He was offering to save my brother at the cost of losing each other. He was offering to give up the first happiness he had found in years for the sake of a boy he had never met, because that boy was important to me. "You would do that?" I whispered. "You would sacrifice everything for my family?" "I would sacrifice everything for you," he replied. "But Rosa, you need to understand what this means. If I do this, we may never see each other again, and there are no guarantees. I might be able to help Antonio, or I might simply disappear into the same darkness that took him. This could be goodbye forever." I thought about my little brother, probably cold and scared and wondering why his family hadn't come for him. I thought about my parents slowly dying from worry and helplessness. I thought about Marco's desperate plans and how they would end in tragedy for all of us. And then I thought about Klaus, this man who had found me in a troubled world and offered me love when I had forgotten what love felt like. This man who was willing to risk everything for people he barely knew, because loving me meant loving the people I loved. The choice was impossible. Save my brother and lose my heart, or keep my heart and risk losing my brother forever. But as I looked into Klaus's brown eyes, I realized there was no choice at all. Family came first. It had to. It was the only mathematics of survival that made any sense. "Go," I said, though the word felt like it was tearing something vital inside my chest. "Find Antonio. Bring him home if you can. And Klaus." I reached up to touch his face, memorizing the feeling of his skin against my palm. "Whatever happens, know that these weeks with you have been the most beautiful of my life." He kissed me then, there by the old mill with the snow falling around us like tears, and I tasted goodbye and the salt on his lips. Klaus left that night, and for 5 days I heard nothing. No word about Antonio. No sign that Klaus had ever existed except for the ache in my chest that felt like a physical wound. On the 6th day, Antonio came home. He was thinner, paler, marked by fear and exhaustion, but he was alive. He had been released, he said, by a foreign officer who claimed there had been a mistake in his detention, that he was clearly too young and innocent to be involved with resistance activities. The officer had even arranged transportation part of the way home. Antonio never saw Klaus's face clearly, never knew his name. But I knew that somewhere out there, the man I loved was still running, still surviving, carrying the memory of our impossible love as he disappeared into history. For 70 years, I have told everyone that Antonio was fortunate, that some anonymous officer had shown unexpected mercy. My family survived the difficult period. We rebuilt our lives. Marco became the doctor he had dreamed of being. Antonio married his childhood sweetheart and gave me beautiful grandchildren. Pap lived to see peace return to our mountains. But every September 15th, the anniversary of the day Klaus and I first spoke in the church, I light a candle and remember. I have imagined 1,000 different lives for him. I have pictured him growing old in South America, in Australia, in some small American town where no one asks too many questions about accents or the shadows that sometimes cross a man's face when he hears certain songs on the radio. I married eventually. A good man named Franco who loved me deeply and never asked why I sometimes stared at the mountains with tears in my eyes. We had 2 children together, and I was a faithful wife for 43 years until illness took him. But even Franco knew, I think, that there was a chamber in my heart he could never enter, a room where I kept candles burning for a ghost with brown eyes and gentle hands. My children grew up, moved away, started families of their own. My grandchildren visited less and less as the years passed, and I became just another old woman with stories they had heard too many times. I accepted this. It is the way of the world. The young must create their own adventures, their own loves, their own secrets to carry. But last month, something extraordinary happened. I was in the market, moving slowly between the stalls with my basket and my walking stick, when a young man approached me. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, and when he smiled at me, I felt a strange flutter of recognition. "Scusi, signora," he said politely. "Are you Rosa Benedetti?" "Rosa, who lived here during the difficult times." "I am," I replied, studying his face more carefully. There was something familiar about the shape of his nose, the way he held his shoulders. "My name is Michael Weber," he said. "I am from Canada now, but my grandfather was from Austria originally. He told me many stories before he passed away, and one of them was about a brave Italian girl named Rosa who saved his life and her brother's life. During those challenging years, the market noise faded away. The world became very still, the way it had that first day in the church when Klaus and I looked at each other and everything changed. "Your grandfather," I whispered. "Klaus Weber. He lived to be 87 years old. He became a teacher in Toronto, married my grandmother Sarah, had 3 children. But he never forgot Italy. Never forgot a girl named Rosa who taught him that love was worth any sacrifice." My walking stick clattered to the cobblestones, but Michael caught my arm before I could fall. "He wanted me to find you," he continued, his voice gentle. "He spent years trying to discover what happened to you, but it was difficult. Different names, different records. He only learned your surname from your brother, and there are many Benedettis in Italy. But when he was passing away, he made me promise to keep looking. He wanted you to know that he never stopped loving you, that you were the light that carried him through all the dark years that followed." From his jacket, Michael produced an envelope yellowed with age. On the front, in handwriting I recognized as clearly as my own, was written, "For Rosa, if she can be found, if she remembers, if she still lights candles." Inside was a letter, written in the careful Italian Klaus had learned from his mother, and with it, a photograph. The same photograph I have carried in my own heart for 70 years. Klaus and me by the old mill, taken by Antonio with an ancient camera just days before everything changed. I had always thought it was lost forever when Klaus disappeared. "He carried this with him always," Michael said, "and he left instructions. If you were found, if you were willing, I was to tell you something else." I looked up at this young man who had his grandfather's eyes, this messenger from a love I thought had ended 70 years ago. There is a house, Michael said quietly, in the mountains outside Toronto. Klaus built it himself after the troubles ended, and he left it to me. But he always said it was meant for two people, that it felt empty with just one. He wanted you to know that there is still a place for you there, if you want it. That love doesn't end just because time passes. I'm 89 years old. My children are grown. My husband is gone. My village has become a place for tourists rather than families. I thought my story was finished, that all my great adventures were behind me. But as I sit here tonight, packing a small suitcase with my few precious belongings, I realize that love writes its own endings. That some stories don't end with goodbye, but with until we meet again. That a woman can be 89 and still have the courage to follow her heart across an ocean toward the memory of brown eyes and impossible promises. Tomorrow, I fly to Canada. Tomorrow, I will see the house that Klaus built for us, the life he imagined we might have shared. I will meet his children and grandchildren, this family that grew from the love we planted in a troubled Italian winter. And perhaps, if the Madonna still listens to the prayers of hopeful old women, I will feel him there, in the rooms he built with his own hands, in the garden he planted with flowers that bloom in Italian colors, in the spaces he kept empty all these years, waiting for a love that began in darkness and is finally coming home to light. They will never know how I truly survived those difficult years. But now, finally, I can tell them about the man I loved in silence for 7 decades. The man who saved my brother, who saved my family, who saved me from becoming someone I wouldn't have recognized. The man who taught me that even in troubled times, even in fear, even when the world is changing, love finds a way.